Hi, and welcome to Enchantment of Eternity's review of Star Trek Voyager Season 2. This video is a part of a series of videos where I review every episode of Star Trek Voyager, one season at a time. So in this video, I'll go through every episode of Season 2 of Voyager and give some of my quick thoughts on each episode. For the purposes of this video, I will assume that you have already seen Season 2 of Voyager and will not spend time explaining what happens in each episode, but more of give my thoughts on the episode. So in the past, I have cited Season 2 as my favorite season of Voyager, but watching again makes me put that statement in doubt. Don't get me wrong, it's still one of my favorite seasons of Voyager, but watching Seasons 1 and 2 back to back, it's hard for me to say which one I like better, but both of these seasons are among my favorites of Voyager, as you had a strong sense of community on the ship as well as strong character stories, something I think got lost in later seasons. However, Season 2 did have a very bumpy start with a group of subpar episodes. Although it did pick up later in the seasons, there were a few horrible episodes here and there throughout the season, whereas Season 1 was more consistently good. On the other hand, Season 2 had some amazing episodes that were much better than anything in Season 1 as well. Season 2 delved even deeper into the characters and character interactions and helped establish Voyager as its own community even further. So it's hard to say, but I think I may have to give the slight edge to Season 2 for that reason alone, despite the fact that Season 2 had more subpar episodes, because it also had some great episodes as well as doing a better job than other seasons of having an interesting cast of fully fleshed out characters. So let's jump into Season 2, starting with the premiere episode, The 37s. So the first group of episodes of Season 2 were originally intended to air in Season 1. For some reason, I don't know why, they were pushed back to Season 2, and funnily enough, all these episodes are not good. Particularly this episode, which was a gimmick episode about the crew running into Amelia Earhart, a plot that never moved beyond the simple gimmick of Captain Janeway meeting Amelia Earhart, because, get it? They're both strong, important women, get it? Ha ha ha. But beyond that, this plot goes nowhere, and it's a bit ridiculous that the aliens came to Earth and transplanted humans all the way to the Delta Quadrant just to use them as slave or labor. I'm sorry, but I'm sure these Delta Quadrant aliens who are conveniently gone by the time that Janeway comes to the planet could have found millions of other races a lot closer to them to use as slave labor. And then we get the scene where Voyager lands for the first time. This scene reminded me a lot of the scene when we first saw the Enterprise D do a saucer separation in the first episode of TNG, and so much as they made a big deal in showing off some new feature of the ship to be like, ooh, look at this, isn't it cool? And then they never really feature it again in any significant way. And the ending of the episode really annoyed me too, as after they discovered the human colony in the Delta Quadrant, they made a big deal about it. Well, if somebody wants to stay behind, and then Janeway and Chakotay were agonizing over what would they do if they lost too many people. What if too many people want to stay behind? So Janeway instructs anyone who wishes to leave to meet in the cargo bay. But when Janeway and Chakotay go to the cargo bay, dun dun dun, nobody's there. Wah wah wah. To be honest, I am quite sick of that stupid cliche where like the captain or someone asks for volunteers to leave and nobody volunteers, or they ask for volunteers to stay and everybody volunteers. I found it impossible to believe that absolutely no one wanted to stay behind on a human colony rather than travel on a long journey, which they would most likely die on before reaching their destination. Sure, maybe the majority of people would want to return to Earth so badly they're willing to take the risk, or perhaps they just don't want to abandon Captain Janeway, but not a single solitary person wanted to stay behind. I don't know. I sense some people were bullied or at the very least peer pressured, but that's just my guess. So next episode was Initiations. Now in my Season 1 review I talked about how a lot of people held the fact that Kazon were in Season 1 against Season 1, but in actuality they didn't actually appear that much. However, they did appear a lot more in Season 2, and there's one episode in particular I can point to and say that this is why the Kazon suck. it's this one. This episode is just annoying to watch, and it's not helped by the fact that they got the actor who played Nog come on and basically play a Kazon version of Nog. And I didn't think it was possible, but they actually managed to make a character even more annoying than Nog. Although I will admit, this isn't the worst episode ever. It was interesting seeing Chakotay bond with this Kazon Nog, but there was just so many blunders in this episode, and it was just so poorly executed. And of course, Kazon Nog, so bloody annoying. Next episode is Projections, and this introduces us to a common theme many episodes in Season 2 have of being mind-bending strange, where you never really know what's going on. And I suspect Bernard Brega was mostly responsible for this, as he wrote what is the best mind-bending episode in Star Trek, in my opinion, TNG's Frame of Mind. And some of these types of episodes worked and others didn't, and this is an example of one that didn't. It was kind of going okay with the story, the Doctor thinking he was a real person and everyone else were holograms, but it just went way overboard with it and got way too convoluted by the end. So overall, not a good episode. But as a side note, many may forget that this was actually the first appearance of Reginald Barclay in Voyager. Even though it was just a hologram of him, we did see Barclay on the screen far before Season 6, and a lot of people forget about that. Next episode is Elogium, where Voyager encounters some side plot aliens that do some bullshit that nobody cares about, that simply create the story for the main plot about Cass going through some Ocampa thingy where it's the only opportunity in her life to become pregnant. And yeah, this episode was kind of boring. The best thing about this episode was the line where Tuvok says, "Captain, I believe we have lost our sex appeal." That line is so great out of context, hence why I didn't give the context of that line just now, because it's better without it. After that, we get NonSequitur, and I realize now that when I was doing my series of reviews with the theme of episodes that I like that everyone else seems to hate, I should have chose this one, because this episode gets a lot of hate, but I actually always liked this episode. But watching it now, I think it is a bit cheesy, but I did like the basic premise of Harry Kim suddenly finding himself in an alternate timeline where he wasn't on Voyager when he got lost in the Delta Quadrant. I guess a lot of people complain that Harry was being dumb by desperately wanting to go back to the Delta Quadrant where he could have lived a happy life with his hot girlfriend on Earth. But I think that complaint kind of misses the whole point of the episode, that Harry couldn't live with himself knowing that Danny Bird took his place when he wasn't meant to, and also that Tom Paris's life was ruined. It shows the kind of character that Harry Kim has, and it's basically his fault because he caused the accident that changed the timeline. So I personally think it made perfect sense why Harry was so desperate to return to Voyager. And I think it actually, as I said, I think it shows how great of a guy Harry is, and shows him for the kind of good guy, a lot of character that he has. I found his farewell scene with his girlfriend really touching. Some of the chase scenes in this episode were a bit Scooby-Doo-ish, so it wasn't one of the best episodes by any means, but I still enjoyed it. So then we move on to Twisted. I never thought that much about this episode. It's a bit of dull and it's uneventful. It's centered around the holodeck program, which we've seen for a while, about this bar in Marseille with the pool table. Every couple of seasons of Voyager seem to want to have like a holodeck program where all the characters hang out. And for the first couple of seasons, it was this one, and I didn't care for it. Actually, I don't care for any of these holodeck things. I just think it would have been better without it. But in any event, this is about Voyager encountering some BS rift that twists Voyager structure where everyone gets lost, and yet all the corridors remain intact with no walls colliding or crashing into each other or anything like that. All the rooms just perfectly switch with one another without any destructions. But frankly, this type of anomaly BS tends to be a B story to some character story that is the A story, but for some reason it was the A story here. But the one thing that makes this episode personally be memorable to me is when I was 19, I once watched this episode with my friends when we were, let's say, intoxicated. And my friends and I were making commentary throughout the episode, kind of like a Mystery Science Theater 3000 situation, and we decided that Neelix had slipped some LSD into the cake that everyone ate, and so everyone was tripping, which is why they kept getting lost and ending up in the wrong place. And when Janeway encountered the weird twisty thingy and starts going nuts and shouting gibberish, we were like, oh, she's having a real bad trip now. And it certainly brought a different meaning to the ending, where after everything was resolved, aka they came down from their trip, Neelix comes on the bridge and yells, "Who wants cake?" And we found that quite amusing and assumed that they would be like, oh no, Neelix, no more cake. Oh, had enough. But that made this episode quite enjoyable. Otherwise, it's dull and boring, and who cares about it? I mean, seriously, the way they solve the crisis is to literally stand around and do nothing. How boring is that? So after that, we get Partouchian, or however you pronounce it, and to be honest, I like this episode more than I remembered after watching it recently. Typically, when I try to come up with a worst episode list, this episode title always gets considered, and after rewatching it now, I don't think it deserves to be. Not that it's a great episode, it most certainly isn't, but it's not that bad either. I just really hated the whole storyline about Neelix being jealous of Tom Paris making moves on Kes. This is a storyline that they've been building up to for several episodes, and I never cared for it, and I thought it was ridiculous when Neelix attacked Tom. However, after watching it now, I see the storyline of Tom and Neelix being in a conflict and then learning to bond after taking care of an alien baby together actually worked really well. And I still don't know if I go as far as to say this is a good episode, but it's definitely not one of the worst. Next episode is Persistence of Vision, and I'll be honest, when this episode first came out, I refused to watch it, and it wasn't until years later that I watched this episode. And the reason why I refused to watch it is because the previews for this episode made it out that this episode would be centered around that hollow novel that we saw Janeway visiting in several episodes at the end of season 1, involving like a Victorian English ghost story, and I absolutely positively hated this storyline so much. I thought it was so boring and pointless. However, when I finally did watch this episode, I realized that it actually wasn't about the hollow novel. It did feature a bit more prominently than it had before, but it was only a means to an end about the greater story of a telepathic alien that causes the crew to become delusional. In fact, I found this was another example of the mind-bending theme this season, and in fact, perhaps the best example, as it works really well for this episode. And surprisingly, I discovered this was actually one of my favorite episodes of the season. It got really intense towards the end when the entire crew were succumbing to their delusions. I absolutely love the storyline with Kes using her telepathic abilities to defeat the alien, and her final confrontation with the alien was really suspenseful. And overall, the whole episode had a richly dark theme to it, and it was very effective. So this actually turned out to be a really good episode. Now, some do complain that the alien's motivations were a bit weak, as the only reason he gave him why he did what he was doing was because he can. I did feel that revelation didn't really work. And also the revelation that he wasn't really there and that he simply vanished. That might have been a bit too much. Like, they didn't really need to do that because it paints him as too powerful to be defeated by Kes. And really, why would someone that powerful waste his time with fucking with other crews? I think I would have liked that ending better had they not added that twist. But it was still a great episode. So next episode is Tattoo, and this is another episode I initially hated, but I never really gave it a fair shot. I was off-put by the ending revelation that the aliens from the Delta Quadrant traveled all the way back to Earth to help the Native Americans become who they were. That's really hokey and kind of insulting to the Native Americans. However, if you look past that, there are really interesting personal stories here with Chakotay and his father, as the flashbacks are very telling on his character, on how he rejected his tribe's traditions in order to join Starfleet, but when his father was killed, he went back to honoring his traditions. It was a really effective and touching personal story that really helped flesh out his character. It's unfortunately they couldn't tell without the hulky aliens, but, you know. So after that, we get Cold Fire, which is the only kind of conclusion we got to the big cliffhanger left open in the pilot episode, where it was revealed that the caretaker had a companion of the same species that was out there somewhere with the capabilities to send them home. This was presented like a huge thread, but this was the only episode that actually addressed this. In fact, even this episode ended in a way that left it open for further sequels, but they never came. I suppose the writers decided the storyline wasn't interesting enough. I, for one, didn't think this episode was that bad at all. I found it really interesting where Kes encounters Ocampans who are far more advanced telepathically than she is on another caretaker station. I did find Suspiria's motivations to wanting to kill the Voyager crew kind of weak, as it was kind of quite dumb of her to think that they killed the caretaker, as that makes no sense because they needed him to help them return home, so why would they kill him? So perhaps that's why she never made another appearance, but I did think this was an effective episode. It was really dark and creepy, and in a good way. I thought it was actually pulled off quite well. So next episode is Maneuvers, which was an adequate Kazon episode. It wasn't great. I don't think it lived up to the potential set in the previous season with Seska's storyline, but it was fine. It's always great seeing Seska again. She is, in my opinion, the best villain that Voyager's ever had. It was cool seeing her exploit her knowledge of Voyager to steal their technology and then give it to Maj Kola to try to strengthen his position amongst the other Kazon. Now, I insist that the Kazon weren't a good villain, but they weren't all that bad. It was interesting that they're different sects and no central power. That's actually more complex than most other Star Trek societies are. And the personal conflict between Seska and Chakotay was interesting, except I think they were playing it up to be more than it was presented before. As in season 1, it was presented like they just had a brief fling, but here it's presented like they were long-time intimate lovers, and that kind of annoyed me a bit. But again, this was an interesting enough episode. It was great seeing Voyager finally get the better of Seska at the end of the episode. So then we get Resistance, and those who have seen my top 10 episodes of Voyager video will know this is one of my favorite episodes of Voyager, and I feel it is severely underrated. I love how this episode deals with the fact that Voyager is all alone and dependent on other aliens, that the aliens they meet for supplies to run their ship, and it explores the possibility on how this dependence could lead them into some sticky situations. And we even see the thing where something supplies going to deplete so much they might be stuck and never be able to go to warp again. I mean, that's some serious shit. But more than that, this episode is just so richly dark and very emotionally effective, as the heart of this episode was Janeway's relationship with the crazy old man who mistakes her for his daughter. Now, he is easy to dismiss as some kook, and in fact, that's all I thought he was at first, but it turns out his backstory is extremely sad and very touching, as we learn that his wife died fighting oppressors and his daughter died trying to rescue her, and in both cases he refused to help them because he was too afraid. And I believe it was one of the most emotionally powerful scenes in the entire show, where while the man lay dying, Janeway told him that she was his daughter and that she forgives him. I have to say, this brings a tear to my eye every time. And it's worth mentioning how amazing the performances from Kate Mulgrew and the actor who played the crazy old man were in this episode. They were so wonderfully pulled off. So yes, it is still, in my opinion, one of the best episodes of the entire show. After this, we get Prototype, which I find a uniquely engaging episode about B'Elanna encountering a damaged robot and becoming obsessed with repairing it, only to discover it was part of some greater robot war, which she was abducted in and forced to participate in. And yet, they did form a bond, and it was ultimately tragic when she was forced to betray him. And I found the whole situation of Voyager being trapped in this robotic war and struggling to get B'Elanna back really engaging. So although I wouldn't say this is one of the best episodes ever, it was certainly interesting in its own right. After that, we get Alliances, which is another episode I think that gets more hate than it deserves. I actually really like this episode, and it's by far one of my favorites that feature the Kazon. This episode was exciting because it opened up an interesting possibility of Voyager being forced to make an alliance with a less than moral adversary, and I suppose many were upset that this wasn't explored as a long-term storyline, and at the end of the episode they just hit the reset button and things go back to normal. And I agree, that also bothered me, as there was potential for a groundbreaking story here, but Voyager has always avoided any extended serialized storylines, which was a larger problem with the show as a whole, but I talked about that a lot before. But despite that, I still thought it was fascinating to explore this possibility in this one episode. I love how Tuvok made the analogy of how the Federation made peace with the Klingons, who were looked on nothing more as a violent band of outlaws until they made peace work. And of course, it was also a good point that any alliance with the Kazon wouldn't be permanent, as they're moving out of their space. And this episode started out in an almost year of hell type situation where Voyager was under constant attack from the Kazon. It's interesting, but Chakotay was saying that they couldn't go on like this. But at the end of the episode, they actually didn't find any solutions to this, and this was never touched on again. So again, the lack of continuity in Voyager bothers me, but as an episode in itself, it's actually quite good. So then we move on to Threshold. Threshold. Universally known as the worst episode of Star Trek Voyager. Now, I have done a full-length review on this episode where I talked about it in more detail, so you can check that out for more of my thoughts. But suffice to say here, I looked for fun and so bad it's good moments, and that didn't really kick in until the ending. I'd say before the ending, it's just your run-of-the-mill, below-average, boring episode about someone transforming into a monster. I suppose even then you have some really bad lines of dialogue, such as Paris yelling out, "Pepperoni pizza!" for no goddamn reason. I was like, what? And then he wanted Kes to kiss him while he was dying, and then the whole concept of warped him and infinite velocity was a bit hokey and stupid. Okay, I take that back. The whole episode was bad, but it's the ending where Janeway and Paris turn into lizards. That's the episode's crowning achievement, and it's fascinating to watch. What in the hell were they thinking, sort of way. So I actually wouldn't say this is the worst episode of Voyager, because most of this episode is just averagely bad, and then the ending is almost so bad it's good, where I think Voyager has actually done worse. But on the other hand, I think it does deserve to get all the hate that it does. However, I've heard some suggest that Season 2 can't be the best season of the show because of this episode, but I totally disagree. It's just one episode, and episodes that are just as bad or worse in every single season. So every season has its blunders. This is simply one of the blunders of Season 2, which is otherwise a good season. So then we come to Meld, which is another episode I've done a full-length review for that you can check out. And frankly, I don't think this episode is a particularly memorable one. I'm surprised that it's loved so much because I don't really think that much of it. It's neither good or bad enough to leave a mark in my mind. I just find it forgettable. I see it more as a failed opportunity to do a cool cat and mouse suspense mystery of Tuvok trying to find the murderer, but instead it's turned into a very predictable story of Tuvok, going mad for a bit while featuring a lot of faulty pulp psychology reasoning, but still not a horrible episode to watch. It's still entertaining. So it's just unremarkable. After that, we get Dreadnought, which is another episode I gained a lot more appreciation for on my recent rewatch. I suppose I never thought much of this episode before because I found the whole concept of there being this Cardassian super weapon missile that was never even hinted at before in Star Trek history to be out there, just to be implausible. As was the concept that the caretaker brought it to the Delta Quadrant. Why in the fuck would he do that? This seems to suggest he was just grabbing things at random, where in the premiere episode it was established that he was purposely grabbing ships to search for compatible species to take his place. So an artificial intelligent missile wouldn't help him do that. So he wouldn't bring it to the Delta Quadrant. And while the storyline of the Dreadnought was being absurdly obtuse, and accepting the fact that it was in the Delta Quadrant. It's not totally implausible. I personally found it implausible enough, and it seems to reek of plot convenience in order to artificially create a crisis for the crew to solve. However, on the recent rewatch where I was able to look past those things, I found it tells a very effective personal story of B'Elanna as she's confronted with the demons of her past and must engage in a game of wits with this super intelligent being that she programmed, almost like she's fighting with her own past. I think it's a wonderful analogy, and I particularly like the backstory of how Chakotay didn't want her, was against her redesigning this Cardassian missile for the Maquis, and she actually did it behind his back, and now it's coming back to like destroy a world, and it could all be her fault. It really raised the stakes for a personal story. And the main storyline of Janeway working hard, almost willing to destroy Voyager at one point in order to save a completely alien race from total destruction, was very powerful as well. So I do have to say, I believe I misjudged this episode before, and it's actually really quite good. So next is a Death Wish, which some have stated is the best episode of Voyager, and I don't really agree. In fact, I wouldn't even go as far as to say that it was one of the best episodes of Voyager. I'd say it's a good quality episode of Voyager, but not one of the best. I think a lot of this episode depends too much on prior knowledge of Q, and like most of Q's non-Next Generation appearances, it was simply a ploy to attract other Trek fans by going, "Ooh, look, we have Q, isn't he cool?" The main point, I think, is I once watched the Deep Space Nine episode Call to Arms and this episode back to back with someone who knew totally nothing about Star Trek, and despite knowing absolutely nothing about Deep Space Nine or the Cardassians or the Dominion or anything, she really enjoyed Call to Arms, but she didn't really care for Death Wish, and I think it just goes to show how dependent Death Wish is on liking and being familiar with Q. And plus, Q being a sexist sleazebag to Janeway was something that was explored more, and it's a second appearance in the Q and the Grey, so it often gets the brunt of the criticism, but actually it began here in this episode and is just as cringeworthy. However, on the other hand, I did find the storyline with Quinn wanting to commit suicide a very powerful one, and the exploration of suicide and when it should be allowed was very powerful. I actually found the ending where Quinn did decide to commit suicide after all, and when he could have lived a life as a human, it was surprisingly emotionally impactful. So I do think this is a really good episode, just not one of the best. After that, we get the episode Life Signs, and I'll be honest, after watching this again, it makes me wonder why in the hell this episode isn't on my top 10 list. I may have to rethink that. I did put this episode as my number one on my Star Trek romance episode list, even beating out City on the Edge of Forever, and although I did receive some criticism for that, I completely stand by that decision, as this episode was probably the most effective and well-executed romance story in all of Star Trek. At times it was light and funny, and other times it was serious and emotionally impactful, and the way this episode blended these things together was simply brilliant. You really could feel for Inara, who lived her whole life being sick and shunned and ugly, and to all of a sudden have an attractive, healthy appearance was shocking for her. And the way she dealt with her reaction to this and other people's reaction to this was brilliant, and the importance of beauty was explored, but what was even more brilliant was the way this was perfectly integrated into the Doctor's own journey into becoming a sentient being and not just a medical hologram. And the scene where he confronts her after she tried to sabotage her own recovery was one of the most emotionally powerful scenes in the entire series. I do believe that this is one of the best episodes of the entire series. After that, we get investigations. So in every episode prior to this one, since Alliances, there was this running side plot about a spy on Voyager, I think Michael Jonas, who was feeding Seska information. Eventually, she was pressuring him to perform sabotage on the ship. And at the same time, Paris was like misbehaving and being insubordinate. And we learn in this episode these two things were related, as it was part of a ploy to try to flesh out who the Kazon spy was. And this was a really great idea. I just think it was executed very poorly. Partly because we never really got the spy's motivations for wanting to do this, and partly because Paris's misbehavior was so obviously out of character for him and cheesy, but mainly because this episode was a poor conclusion to that story arc, as it centered around Neelix doing a morning show. A fucking morning show, like Good Morning America or something like that. How stupid is that? And he all of a sudden acts like he's a fucking reporter because of all of this. The whole premise of this episode was Neelix being an investigative reporter simply because he does a stupid morning show. And this is something never seen before, and thank God, never seen again. And it just makes it really idiotic ploy, and it's just a really bad episode. So then we get Deadlock, which I think is another sorely overlooked and underrated episode. I have ranked this as my number 2 best episode of all of Voyager. Now, it does remain to be seen if I will stand by that ranking, but either way, this is easily in the top 5 best episodes of Voyager for me. And it seems to me that most people get stuck on the scientifically implausibility of this episode. But really, this is Star Trek, which is never known for its scientific accuracy. So I feel you just need to suspend disbelief and move on. And if you do, you'll find this is one of the best told and most fascinating stories in the Star Trek franchise. Or at least I do, anyway. From start to finish, I think this episode just grabs you and never lets go with a non-stop thrill ride full of twists and turns, and it's extremely dark at times as you see a baby die. Ensign Kim dies, and at the end of the episode, the entire crew of Voyager is killed by the Vidians who steal their organs. And the way this was accomplished was so simply brilliant. I get goosebumps every time I watch this scene. Not to mention the whole storyline of there being 2 Voyagers and the 2 crews having to work together being a completely fascinating one. And seeing the 2 Janeways argue with each other in person was nothing less than brilliant, and required some brilliant acting on Kate McGrew's part. So overall, I still think this is one of the best episodes of the entire Star Trek franchise. So next, there's Innocence, an episode I never liked and always thought of as a horrible episode, but after watching it again, I realized it does have a good ending that has a good message about how this whole crisis with a Voyager and his alien could have been avoided had the alien simply communicated more with Voyager instead of avoiding them, and how Janeway and crew jumped to conclusions without knowing the full story. So it's an interesting story of cultural misunderstanding. That being said, a vast majority of this episode is nearly impossible to watch, as it's just a bunch of kids being stereotypical misbehaving children while Tuvok has to take care of them, and at one point he even tries to teach them Vulcan meditation. That is so dumb. However, I did enjoy the bond Tuvok formed with the little girl at the end of the episode and how he effectively looked after her in her time of death. But on the other hand, I found it too convenient that any talk that would give away that she's really old and not young was very conveniently avoided. So overall, this episode isn't as bad as I thought, but it's still not good. Okay, so next we get to the Thal, which is another episode I've done a full-length review of, which you can check out. And when I did that review, I realized this episode was a lot better than I thought it was. As many cite this as one of their favorite episodes. I'm not sure if I go that far to say it was one of my favorites, as the premise of the episode is really simplistic, and there are some flaws, which I talked about in my full-length review. But overall, I think it was a very effective in creating an intense situation, and moreover, Michael McKean was absolutely brilliant as the clown in this episode. This episode was really intense throughout, and it really, the atmosphere that it created with like these, crazy freaking clown people who were laughing as they chop people's head off was just scary. And the ending where Janeway effectively tricks the clown into defeating him as he dies, he says he's afraid, to which Janeway responds, "I know," was one of the most badass moments in the entire series. So overall, this is a really great episode. Okay, so I guess because we have to, I guess we'll get to Tuvix. Now, I gotta be honest, this was the hardest episode in my entire rewatch so far for me to watch. The entire time I was watching it, a voice in my head was screaming at me to turn this crap off and trying to convince me how easy it would be to lie and say I watched this episode rather than have to endure this giant dumpster fire again. And I always got to be honest, I'm sick of talking about this episode. I'm certainly sick of arguing about this episode. I think the whole premise of the ending of the episode was fake, faulty, and executed extremely poorly. And if you want to know more about what I mean by this, you can check out my full-length review of this episode where I get into more detail, which I won't go into now because I'm sick of talking about it. But know that if you are looking for an argument, you won't get one because I'm sick of arguing about this too. And furthermore, I know I'm right, and watching this episode again just confirmed that for me. The one thing I will say is, regardless of the faulty premise, this episode features some of the absolute worst writing in all of Voyager. The dialogue is horrible, and this in turn affects the acting, and the whole tone of this episode is completely inconsistent. It was originally imagined as a comedic episode, which frankly I think it should have been, and it even begins that way with it has this attitude. It's like, oh look, two fucking Neelix combined, isn't this funny? But then all of a sudden it jokingly goes into over-the-top melodrama with Tuvix all of a sudden screaming, "I want to live!" It is without a doubt one of the worst written and poorly executed episodes in all of Star Trek, and I'm sticking by that opinion. I don't care what anybody else says. Anyway, moving on beyond that, we come to Resolutions, which is again, when I first saw it, I dismissed it as a misguided attempt to create a cliched TV cliche where they have a will they, won't they romance between the male and female leads of the series. But I actually didn't really give it a chance. In later years, when I actually watched this episode from start to finish, I saw it was actually much more than that. That the natural development of feelings between Janeway and Chakotay were extremely natural and made a lot of sense. And Chakotay's whole story of the angry warrior meeting the female leader and finding meaning was extremely touching. And it was just one of the most memorable scenes of the entire show. On top of that, the story with Tuvok in command of Voyager, where Cam is almost relieved of duty permanently by constantly insisting that they contact the Vidians. And when they actually do, we get a brief reunion between the Doctor and Inara as she helps them find the cure that they need. But the most powerful thing about this episode was the ending, where Chakotay and Janeway clearly formed a romantic relationship, and they were forced to immediately abandon this as soon as they were back on Voyager. The scene where they were on the bridge giving orders like normal officers again was so brilliant in this subtext, because it was all subtext. And I do wonder, because this episode was never clear about this, if the two of them actually banged. I'm pretty sure they did, but that's just my guess. Anyways, this finally brings us to the finale, Basics Part 1. This episode was okay, but it felt almost too telegraphed. Has this grand conflict between Voyager and the Kazon. But if I remember correctly, the previews to this episode gave away the ending where the Kazon took over Voyager and stranded the crew on the planet, which kind of deflated all the tension in this episode for me, because it knew what was going to happen. And the whole storyline with Chakotay going after his son wasn't really that interesting, because the whole concept of Seska impregnating herself with Chakotay's DNA was really implausible and a bit ridiculous to begin with. And watching this episode is just Yeah, it's okay, because it's a bit frustrating seeing the Kazon get the better of Voyager at every turn, as they can sense a trap, yet they fall into it anyway. But I do have to say, the ending was super suspenseful and really made you wonder how the hell they were going to get out of this. So it was a very effective cliffhanger that did pay off the whole Kazon story arc. So it was a fairly decent episode. Fairly good, I'd say. So that's it. That's all the episodes in season 2. So now it's time for me to name the best and worst episodes of the season. And we'll start with the worst episode. There were some really bad episodes like the 37s, Initiations, Elogium, Twisted, Investigations, and Innocent. But really, this comes down to 2 episodes. So I find myself facing a choice. I can either choose the popular choice, the episode I know everyone is expecting me to pick as the worst episode of the season, or I can pick my honest choice, the episode I actually think is the worst episode of the season, as it was the hardest for me to watch again. And if you're familiar with my channel, you may know that given that option, I tend to go for the honest choice, because I like being honest with my viewers and being honest about my opinions, regardless of how unpopular they are, rather than just telling you what I think you want to hear. Therefore, instead of picking Threshold like everyone would expect, I have to very honestly say I do feel that Tuvix is easily the worst episode of season 2. There's an element of enjoyment in watching Threshold because the ending is so dumb and makes you wonder what the hell they were thinking. Whereas with Tuvix, I get absolutely no enjoyment from watching this episode. And in fact, it really frustrates me, as the entire thing is just a poorly written mess that absolutely nothing about it works, and it's clearly inconsistent, and it's just one of the worst written episodes of the entire show. But moving on to the best episode of the season, this one's even tougher, as there are a lot of great episodes this season, such as Persistence of Vision, Resistance, Alliances, Life Signs, the Thal, and Resolutions. But ultimately, I had to stick with one of my favorite Star Trek episodes, Deadlock. This episode was simply amazing, as we get the dark vision of seeing the crew die and the fascinating interactions between 2 Janeways talking to each other and the crew trying to cope with the richly bizarre situation, and most of all, total badass moment where the Vidians come on the bridge and Janeway nods at them and says, "Welcome to the bridge," just before blowing up the entire ship. Now that is badass. So my overall rating for Star Trek Voyager Season 2 out of 10 is a 9. Excellent. I really wanted to give this season a 10 because it is one of my favorite seasons of Voyager. Not only does it have a lot of my all-time favorite episodes like Deadlock, Resistance, and Life Signs, but also I feel this season as a whole, even the lesser quality episodes, feature a more concrete cast of fully developed characters with interesting character stories that focus more on their interactions rather than simply having random aliens show up and attack Voyager every week. In my opinion, both seasons 1 and 2 were the heydays of Voyager, where it still had a lot of potential if only it would push more into being serialized. But unfortunately, they actually went the other direction in later seasons, to the show's obvious detriment. And with the exception of season 4, I would say future seasons were subpar to these first 2 seasons and failed to capture the feeling of community and strong personal stories present in season 2, making it one of my favorite, if not my favorite, season of Star Trek Voyager. So that's it for my review of Star Trek Voyager Season 2. I'll be back in roughly a month for my full-length review of Season 3. But in the meantime, you can check out my channel for many more Star Trek videos. In fact, you can request an episode from any of the 5 Star Trek series for me to review, and I'll endeavor to do so, but please only 1 episode request per person. So be sure to check that out, as well as I do many more videos on other shows like Game of Thrones, Dark Matter, and more. So be sure to subscribe so you can keep up with all of that. And thanks a lot for watching.